So, sorry, when I start here, two apologies and sort of insincere pseudo-apology. I'm sick, so if I'm doing disgusting things like pouring snot out of my body, I'm really sorry. Secondly, I'm going to mostly read because this is from a much longer paper, and I'm afraid if I talk through it, I'll totally screw up my time. So this is just going to be to give you little outline-y things. The pseudo-apology, it's come to my attention that there are some sad and benighted humans who are existing without having seen the film Casablanca. I don't understand this form of life, and you really, it's on you. You just got to get better. So hopefully, even if you are uncivilized, you'll be able to follow this. So the classic film Casablanca is structured around three great love stories. Two are incomplete and crucially non-ideal in context, while the third, less commonly discussed as such, is the emotional and narrative climax of the film, an ideal of human solidarity that exists in harmony with the demands of the social and political context. So consider first the relationship of Ilsa and Victor. Ilsa admires Victor, cares for him, supports his crucially important work, and she is furthermore his wife. But she married him as a young girl, and after Paris, she knows she will never have the passion for him that she has for Rick. Victor, too, is oddly disconnected and dispassionate in his interactions with Ilsa. His passion is first and foremost for his work. And for this reason, their love is shown throughout the film to be damaged, lacking in ways that are essential to its telos. At the same time, the very existence of this prior relationship and the way that Ilsa is a part of Victor's work show the limitations of Rick and Ilsa's love. Their love was essentially tied to a particular time and place. We'll always have Paris. We lost it, but we got it back after last night. Indeed, the events in Casablanca reconstitute the significance of Paris, but not in a way that makes it an enduring or viable love in the present. In contrast to both of these, the love of Rick and Louis is a fully apt and enduring friendship, one that survived the worst times for each in Casablanca, where they supported one another through their mutual addictions and self-indulgence. Their friendship reaches fruition at the end of the film as an equal relationship that can be fully embraced, consonant with the political demands facing them. Themes of faith, trust, commitment, moral holding run throughout the film. Each of the protagonists shows faith in the others and in a way that holds them to their best selves. Louis' insistence that Rick is a sentimentalist at heart. Rick's pointed faith that Louis does indeed have a heart. Ilsa's faith in Rick to do the thinking for both of us, not to mention the mere act of showing up at this particular gin joint of all the gin joints in all the world. Victor's quiet faith in Rick culminating in his climactic "welcome back to the fight, this time I know our side will win." Rick's public dismissal of the idea that the Nazis could control Victor, and Ilsa's final line, "Goodbye, Rick, God bless you." Nor is this faith merely expressed in verbal commitments. The crucial narrative arc of the film begins with the Marseillaise scene. After the long introduction of the many characters and plot complications, we find all the main characters in Rick's bar, as Major Strasser leads his Nazi comrades in a rousing rendition of Die Wacht am Rhein. In reaction, Victor demands that the band play La Marseillaise, one of the most classic scenes of all films of all time. If for no other reason, you need to watch the damn film just to see this scene. But before the camera turns to Victor, the first reaction to Strasser is a long look between Rick and Louis, as if each is putting the other to the question, whether this is the moment to show defiance. Each, it seems, is both tentatively offering his own inclination and, in the same act, challenging the other. Then, when Victor makes his demand of the band leader looks as well to Rick, seeking confirmation. Victor is always the public symbol of resistance, but it's Rick whose defiance matters in Casablanca. Rick, of course, knows what his endorsement means, that by nodding he is putting to permanent lie his apolitical life of a mere saloon keeper and marking himself as an enemy of the Reich. This small nod is Rick's acknowledgement of his commitment, called for by Louis and Victor, implicitly even by Ilsa and many of the others in the bar, to return to the fight. The entire rest of the film, in essence, is a spelling out of the normative and narrative significance implicit in that nod. This narrative culminates in the final climactic scene, which contains the pivot of Rick and Louis' relationship as they move from their mutual support of a holding pattern, waiting in Casablanca, always waiting, to the culmination of their relationship. Right, so the famous scene, Louis says, "Rick, you're not only a sentimentalist, you're a patriot." Rick, "It seemed like a good time to start. I think perhaps you're right. It would be a good idea for you to disappear from Casablanca for a while. There's a free French garrison over at Brazzaville. I could be induced to arrange a passage. With a letter of transit? I could use a trip. It doesn't make any difference about our bet. You still owe me 10,000 francs. And that 10,000 francs should just about pay our expenses." "Our expenses?" "Uh-huh. Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship." Okay, so this scene is, of course, remarkably tender. It expresses a contextually perfect sort of love, or if you like, solidarity. This is, of course, an extraordinary context, one in which it doesn't take much to see that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans. And in this world, resisting fascism trumps passion, hedonistic indulgence, and cynicism. But this is no story of duty trumping love, but rather of duty expressed in love. Casablanca is a story of finding right relation, of finding the apt way for love to be expressed in a life of struggle. Rick shows his faith in Louis by assassinating Strasser, thus putting his life in Louis' hands. Louis matches this by first covering up the murder, then accompanying Rick into a life of resistance. It's through these mutually reinforcing acts that they hold one another to more such acts in the future, and at the same time institute their friendship as a new way of being together. And it's the structure of that faith that I explore in what follows, after a few preliminary remarks on methodology. When philosophers turn to the investigation of language or concepts in an effort to illuminate a philosophical topic, there's a certain methodological orientation, usually implicit, but easily discernible nonetheless. I'll call this methodology the semantic top-down methodology. That is, if one wants to investigate a concept like faith, linguistically, one considers first what the word means. Typically, that involves considering what is entailed by or entails a claim involving it. That is, one looks at candidate universal generalizations, like one has faith that P if and only if one believes that P, trying on various situations to see if this seems to be a truth that follows from the meaning of the term. In one way or another, the totality of this linguistic data is then to be systematized into a semantic account. After agreeing on a semantic content for faith, two other questions arise. What epistemic standards govern faith beliefs, or sometimes faith claims, depending on your view on epistemology? And what other pragmatic effects do faith claims have? This latter, the pragmatics of faith talk, is typically given a derivative role in two senses. First, pragmatics is invoked to clean up scattered anomalies in linguistic use that aren't explainable directly via semantics, conversational implicature, and all that other junk. Second, pragmatics may be invoked to account for subsidiary functions of speech acts that are primarily defined by their semantics. An alternative methodology is possible. Call it pragmatic bottom-up. On this approach, one would begin not by looking for those entailments, truth conditions, whatnot, had in common by all claims of a given syntactic type. Rather, one would survey the range of things one does with speech acts involving the word and related words, and it's important to add even communicative nods that do not involve words at all. With some such survey in hand, one would then assess the broader philosophical, social, normative, etc. import of these functions and only derivatively assess whether there is some pattern at the semantic level connecting these functions to a syntactic category of speech act. I'll just mention in passing that these are strictly independent, the bottom-up and semantic top-down, and so you could have, whoops, what? Where's all my slides? Oh no. All my slides are missing. Oh, that's weird. Okay, well, they're in strange order. Okay, so you could be a pragmatic top-down theorist. I think Brandom is. I'm not going to talk about this. Or a semantic bottom-up theorist. Charles Travis is. All right. Let's just stay there for now. Okay. This methodological distinction is correlated with two others. First, semantic theorists, at least philosophers, but to some extent linguists as well, tend to give priority to declaratives, either taking the content of declaratives to be the basic element in terms of which the content of other linguistic categories is understood. So philosophers as diverse as Searle and Brandom both claim this. Or taking the semantics of declaratives to be the main locus of philosophical concern. Virtually all philosophers in the analytic tradition do that. Not so much in the continental tradition, it's interesting. For example, Derrida has some fascinating work on the pragmatics of various kinds of speech acts. Now, it's a short step from this orientation to a second methodological assumption that I call the normative valorization of the epistemic. If the main philosophically significant element of language is the declarative, and the central relevant tool for analyzing it is semantics, then one will be focused on things like truth conditions, or maybe inferential role or justification conditions. Thus, when one turns to modes of normative assessment, the natural thing to do is to focus on the epistemic. Yes, of course, we do other things than make truth claims with our speech acts, and there are lots of ways such things could be evaluated, but it's hard for most philosophers to see non-epistemic modes of assessment as anything other than secondary to the philosophical enterprise. In what follows, I explore communicative acts that are naturally expressed in terms of faith and related terms, utilizing a pragmatic bottom-up methodology that explicitly eschews both the prioritization of truth claims and the centrality of epistemic evaluation. More specifically, I consider a range of constructive pragmatic functions, right? Think of performatives, but in a much broader sense. That is to say, speech acts that build something, that are frequently instantiated by speech acts involving the word faith, functions that invoke and maintain normative statuses, relations, and roles. My guiding aim here is to identify the structure of an aspect of social interaction that I take to be important, not to just survey and describe ordinary usage or something of that sort. I think that, in fact, the structure I want to point to is philosophically central to our understanding of ourselves as social beings. All right. So, stepping back from actual agents, wolves exhibit an elaborate degree of social coordination. I think what I'm saying is true of wolves. It doesn't really matter. Consider these imaginary wolves that do what I say they do. It's a thought experiment, not a real claim. But they exhibit an elaborate degree of social coordination. When they hunt large animals, wolves engage in forms of behavior that are individually irrational, but collectively rational. That is, individual wolves charge much larger animals, including moose. To do so alone and without the cooperation of other wolves would be near suicidal. But as the moose turns toward one wolf, another will charge in and bite its hind legs. With such similarly coordinated attacks over time, a group of wolves can bring down a moose. Individual wolves, we might say a bit fancifully, have faith in their comrades, faith that they will participate alongside them in the hunt. The wolves put their lives in the hands of other wolves. But each does so, and this is the important point, each does so precisely by living up to the faith shown in it by the other wolves. Each hunting act by a given wolf is then both a call to others to support and a response to a call by others for it to support. This very specific form of mutual recognition and mutual holding through acting is a structure I call symmetrical coordinative faith in. There. Pronounced SCFI, pronounced sci-fi. Because you got to pronounce it somehow. And this structure institutes the very practice of the wolf hunt, as well as the roles that the various wolves play in that hunt, and the norms governing and expectations concerning what each will do in the hunt. The form of life of the wolf hunt is maintained by such a process of faith in one another. Young wolves learn how to hunt by watching others trust one another in this way, and by being accorded such trust themselves. Trust that carries with it a normative expectation to try, learn, and eventually succeed. Once competent, the ongoing life of the pack is maintained by habitual holdings of this sort. Thus, not only the practice of the hunt, but what it is to be a wolf in the social sense is instituted by such faith. Now, of course, there are many ways to hold another critter, wolf or human, to a given behavior, other than this sort of reciprocal, trusting faith in one another. One of the most obvious is via a mechanism of hierarchical control, from the simplest threat of a wolf showing teeth to the most complex demand of an employer over an economically dependent employee. And of course, there are all manner of less direct means of holding others to living up to various norms. The expression of reactive attitudes, reiterating moral injunctions, issuing second personal requests, encouragements, etc. But a non-reciprocal holding, especially one that's based on dominance, will be fragile in certain ways. First, it will depend on the continued existence of the relevant dominance. If someone ceases to be subordinate, whether economically, politically, or in the size of their teeth, they will no longer be moved by a holding based on threat, coercion, or social position. Second, any form of holding based in differential social authority is likely to be one that breeds defiance. Since the source of its authority does not lie in the endorsement or engagement with the behavior of the individual held, that party is not antecedently inclined to engage in it. Thus, even if direct defiance is impossible, one can expect all manner of minimal compliance. Work slow down, for example. Behaviors enforced through threat thus tend toward the routine and simplistic over time and tend to die out or be overthrown. Of course, there's a whole lot of things we could argue about there, but I believe what I just said. Actions reinforced by patterns of sci-fi, by contrast, involves a sort of social feedback loop. That's what you have up here. Phi is an act by X of engaging in a given social practice, P, or an undertaking of a commitment to engage in social practice, P. So I charge the wolf. Phi, that act also communicates some sort of holding to Y. It tells the other wolves that they need to swing around to the back of the wolf. So it's a kind of holding of other critters to behavior psi that is itself an engagement with practice P, or an act of undertaking commitment. Don't worry about that. And at the same time, that act holds me to further, because as they charge around and the wolf and the moose swings to hit them, their act calls upon me now to attack the hind legs and things. So there's a kind of feedback in the responding to a call, while at the same time holding others, being a call to hold others to continued engagement. Co-parents, friends, comrades, teammates, and colleagues, as much as wolves, engage in such symmetrical mutual holdings as a matter of course. They thereby reinforce one another in actions both endorse. And by doing so, via the very participation in the social act in question, they give positive feedback, both in terms of external results, moose for dinner, flourishing children, successful revolutions, wins in basketball games, and in terms of internal successful response, satisfying the immediate concerns of one's co-participants. In contrast with a mere external demand or encouragement of you to do the right thing, when I walk with you, express faith in you by engaging myself in the same project, I lessen the risk of your participation because we're now doing it together, so there's a better chance of success. I make various coordinative acts possible. I provide an example. All of this in the very act of providing a second personal reason for you to participate with me. Behaviors of this self-reinforcing sort not only tend to continue, but to grow in complexity. Excuse me. Since there's a shared external goal to which holdings to a specific behavior are to a large extent subservient, one can expect sci-fi reinforced behavior to grow in complexity over time. If a wolf riffs on current practice and successfully brings down a moose, or a friend suggests a new activity that will strengthen our friendship, this will be seen as a success by the other participants and as an unexpected way of living out the faith shown in them. In contrast, someone who riffs on what is commanded in an authoritarian holding will simply have violated orders. So let's return to the case of a beautiful friendship and consider some more details of the symmetrical faith that Rick and Louis show in one another. If If we treat the friendship of Rick and Louis as paradigmatic, we can note 7 functional elements. Some of these are just implications of other elements of their ongoing faith in one another. So first, sci-fi is typically risky. Rick and Louis are both quite literally risking their lives on their faith in one another and the path that this faith is leading them upon. On the way, all manner of actions that continue to express this mode of engagement will involve similar risks. I mean, they're fighting the Nazis after all. Sci-fi is a kind of holding. Rick, by killing Strasser in front of Louis and giving up the letter of transit to Victor and Ilse, puts the question to Louis of who he is. Is he ultimately a collaborateur with the Vichy government, living life for no more than to take advantage of innocent young women, or a man of principle who will fight for a free France? Temporizing, which has been the fundamental attitude of Louis' life in Casablanca, is simply no longer possible. He must now either turn his friend in to certain death at the hands of the Nazis, or embrace a new life. And Louis, in turn, by covering for the killing of Strasser and leaving with Rick, holds Rick to the truly hard road, not the remote road of dramatic and romantic sacrifice followed by prison, a road that in the end is not so hard for someone with years of experience wallowing in self-pity, but the long road of effective resistance to fascism. 3, the holding of each other and the risk-taking engagement oneself, as emphasized above, are not separate acts. Each brings the other along by way of risk-taking accompaniment. We hold each other by way of walking with them. And this is the feature that makes such faith in one another symmetrical, a form of mutual recognition in Hegel's sense. 5, such faith endorses implicitly or explicitly the behavior that it demonstrates faith in. There is no mere behavioral, not merely behavioral reinforcing of an action, but a commitment to the action and the practice within which it functions. 6, this normative emphasis should not hide the fact that an expression of this sort of faith implicitly involves a kind of a practical prediction that others will live up to their faith. That is, each acts in a way that only makes sense if the other lives up to their faith. The point is not that one must or even typically does believe that others will live up to their faith. I don't much care about belief, actually. Rick might be genuinely unsure whether Louis will join him. But one stakes one's actions on the assumption that faith will be merited. One calculates specific actions that one's going to perform under the presumption that the other will cooperate, and one commits oneself to helping make it so. Finally, 7, the mode of engagement that is ongoing sci-fi is essentially communicative. While there may be a unified psychological state underlying and leading to such an ongoing pattern of social behavior, the social utility of such a state lies in the effects of its behavioral expression, and this expression is essentially social. It's collectively useful for us to form beautiful friendships with our comrades in the fight against fascism, just as it's collectively useful for wolves to have faith in one another in a hunt. But such utility essentially depends on the fact that it's communicated to others in a way that holds them to similar behavior. The state in a mere individual considered in isolation from others is completely pointless. It loses its entire telos. So the existence of sci-fi, here understood as containing all the functional elements 1 to 7, does not depend on a crazy world with fascists sweeping over Europe, love triangles, or dramatic acts of self-sacrificing love. Indeed, virtually all human behavior is socially coordinative in this sense. Whether we're playing chess, carrying out laboratory experiments, or raising a child together, the fact that we occupy particular normative positions in the space of this practice is both constituted and maintained by an ongoing structure of sci-fi. In even so everyday and mundane a communicative act as saying, "I'll cook tonight," to my wife, I engage in the joint project of making a home together. I risk exploitation or rejection, and thereby signal through my commitment to do my part, a holding of my partner to reflect this engagement, and this holding by eating with me, by washing up, by offering to cook tomorrow, or whatever. Acts that will in turn serve to express a faith in my own engagement that will hold me to my own role in the future. Okay, I'm going to skip a section here because it's already, don't have much time left. So I see, this is a sort of core, a pure socially coordinative faith in action that has all these elements. And we can perform actions that riff from this by by varying along any of these dimensions in small ways, and see other kinds of faith in someone as slightly derivative riffs on this central case, or so I claim. And so I have a section in which I go through a whole bunch of variants and riffs and different types. I'm happy to talk about this if people want, but to get done in time, I'm going to move on. Okay, faith that. So far my focus has been on acts that communicate faith in other people, whether they're linguistic acts or not. But a more frequent focus of discussion in the literature on faith is faith that. Of course, much of the motivation for this focus is the question of whether religious faith, in particular, is rational, and if so, whether it provides a justification for cognitive attitudes toward particular religious doctrines that are not justified via more normal epistemic considerations. These are fine issues, and I actually hope to address them in some future work, but for now I want to emphasize some important commonalities in the productive function of certain mundane expressions of faith that with the structure of core sci-fi. So I'm not going to be having that goal here. So it's not hard to see that at least some expressions of faith that essentially function pragmatically as mere terminological variants of sci-fis. I might say that I have faith in you to do your part in the struggle, or I might express faith that you will succeed in carrying out your job successfully. These, I take it, have the same pragmatic function as saying that I have faith in you in the right context. Beyond this, I take paradigmatic claims to have faith that P, at least many paradigmatic claims to have faith that P, to express faith in someone together with a commitment to the truth of P that follows from that commitment. So the difference between saying I believe P and I have faith that P in many contexts is simply a way of expressing my belief as following from my faith in the more fundamental practical sense. So Victor saying that he knows that our side will win because he has faith in Rick. Victor believes that our side will win because he has faith in Rick. And that's the point of calling it faith, that it's derived from his relation to Rick. All right, so I'm going to turn to a famous speech by Martin Luther King. You've all, I trust, heard this, even if you haven't seen Casablanca, which uses the language of faith throughout. I feel a little embarrassed reciting a speech by Martin Luther King for obvious reasons. King says, "But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We interesting phrase, refuse to believe, right? For all of you who say you can't do these things. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation, and so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope, and this is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day." All right. Now, in giving that speech, King was not engaging directly in the struggle. He was not here struggling alongside his comrades, going to jail, or confronting power. So his act is not precisely a sci-fi act. Rather, it was a call to acts of socially coordinative faith in. He's articulating a range of actions, goals, and ends that structure a particular sort of movement, all of them which would be, if performed, sci-fis, and imploring the assembled masses to participate in them. The various acts he's acknowledging and endorsing and then calling others to participate in center upon the truths in which he expresses faith and the values to which he commits himself. King's expression of faith in the self-evident truths, for example, of the Constitution made whole and real, is a call to enter into a practice in which we hold one another to our roles as nonviolent revolutionaries, a pattern of holding that was to become the civil rights movement. King's speech, directed as it was at a much larger audience than was already directly involved, aims for what we might call an invocative function. And it attempts, that is, to bring the fundamental sort of practical faith about by way of a prefigurative laying out of roles as if the masses are already engaged in them. All right, I'm also going to skip a long section. So when I talk about that, so what King is doing here is calling for, by way of prefiguratively describing as if it already exists, acts of sci-fi, right? So that's a kind of normative condition having to do with the input of these sci-fi acts, mostly through the paper I've been talking about their output, that is to say the normative effects that an act of walking in faith with someone has. This brings in the question of norms that govern the production of those acts, and there's a lot to be said about the conditions under which they're entitled, the conditions under which they're obliged, things like that. Again, I'm just going to skip that because my time is almost up. And I will simply conclude. I claim I've identified a core communicative functional cluster that's naturally described as an expression of faith in others, along with a general orientation toward others that's naturally described as living out our faith in them. Such faith is a complex sort of mutually recognitive holding by accompanying. I claim that such engagements in ongoing mutual holdings are ubiquitous and that they form a constitutive dimension of typical human social practices. I offered a few preliminary thoughts about the dimension, I skipped offering a few preliminary thoughts about the dimensions of variety among such acts, but I would have if I'd had more time, and about the range of distinct functions that can be seen as constitutively related to these core ones. The picture that emerges is the barest start of a conceptual map of faith that sees such complex social holdings, the sci-fi ones, as a sort of center, with other related acts standing at various peripheral points related by various kinds of explanatory dependency. My hope is that this preliminary sketch will motivate the methodological orientation I'm pursuing here. I have faith, that is, in philosophers more capable and more industrious than myself, to take up this project with me, allowing us to make more progress on the details than I ever could alone. Thank you.